Fantastic. Hi, Jordi.
How are you doing?
I am fine, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm doing
I
well.
mean, it's
Enjoying
been a
this
long,
this.
long time, and it's really great to see you in such good shape despite these weird times, you know?
Oh no, it is really weird times, but it's again same thing. It's nice to see you again and see that you're still pushing for the right things and
Thank
doing well. So
you.
that's always good.
And thanks for being part of this new series, I'll call it this way. As we evolve, we'll find an interesting name. Right now, it's called Ask NMD because the principle relies on the fact that we have people from all over, hopefully more Africa than elsewhere, because many questions come from there, right?
Hmm.
Where they ask questions, and I want to be able to invite people like you, others, to share
Hmm.
answering these questions.
And we're happy to do so. And it's actually a lot of stuff is happening in Africa in space, which is good to see. So I think you're it's good timing.
Ah, great. Yeah, yeah, I agree. We'll start first with who. I mean, we know now who is Professor Jordi Puig-Suari, no?
Hmm.
With everything, the scientist, the inventor, the who is Jordi, the guy, the man?
Well, the guy it's actually interesting because I experienced living in a place that didn't do aerospace. I grew up in Spain, and when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, Spain had one company, I think, that made like one airplane, and there were no jobs in aerospace. We were not part of the EU. We were not part of Airbus. All the things that have happened were not there. So the advice I got from people is go do something else because this is not going to go well. You'll study aerospace and you'll work on washing machines because you'll know a lot about fluid dynamics. And and I was crazy about planes, so I got the opportunity to go to the US and study there, which was great. And I went there for 4 years and stayed for the rest of my life because I never went back.
Ah,
Um, and in the process of going to school, and this was actually a very interesting thing, I was into airplanes because I could go to the airport, and you could see the planes landing, and it was really cool.
ah.
And when I went to school, there were people with me in school that said, "Oh no, I don't really like airplanes. I want to go to Mars. I want to do spacecraft." And I was like, "Wait a minute, you can do that?" And they're like, "Yeah, of course. I mean, we do that all the time. It's called NASA. You go work for them, and they do that kind of stuff." And I took an orbits class, and I really liked it. And I said, "Hey, maybe I don't want to do airplanes. Maybe I want to do spacecraft." But the thing that stayed with me is this idea that I didn't even have it in my
Mm.
peripheral vision. Space was an impossible. There was like some people that did that, but it was not something I could do.
Yeah, it was for others,
Um,
the chosen
yeah,
one.
yeah, it's others, the chosen ones, exactly. It's very smart, very important people, the rocket
Yeah.
scientists. Um, but which in some extent, the space industry for many years pushed that narrative that this is very difficult, only a few people can do it, it's rocket science. Um, and that kind of stayed with me. I became a professor. I started teaching students. Um, and then when we started CubeSat, and we can talk more about that, but the idea that all of a sudden all these people that space was not an option became an option kind of really resonated with me because it's like, oh, I remember that. When I was in that, you have to go to the US or Europe or Russia, that, or Japan. There's only like 4 places where you can do this. And then you start talking with people like yourself and the Cube team and people like that say, oh, we're doing this in Colombia or in South Africa or in Vietnam. And it's like, this is really cool because that didn't happen to me. And I'm glad that I could help that happen to other people because for me, it was, I mean, I left my country. I mean, I'm very happy about it. I
Mm.
have my family and met my wife and I would have had a different life. But that initial frustration of I have to leave was kind of not nice. and having had the opportunity of doing it and seeing it as possible where I was would have been nice. So it's really cool to see that we're giving that opportunity to other people, and we're democratizing space, and now it's something that a lot more people think I can do if I like it. I mean, you may end up doing cell phones after you go to school and you decide that that's more interesting, but you don't have to go do washing machines because there is no option, and you're a very good fluids person.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean,
yeah, that was a bad day.
it's a great how can I say story. It's a human story of someone who again didn't think it was for them, and who ended
Yep.
up, and it's a great segue into the questions, right? Because I want to pick from the lot, right, of the questions, and we'll have two of them. The
Yep.
first, which is how did CubeSats begin, right? And
Yep.
it's interesting that that I'm having the conversation with you, and we have that question, because you're one of the guys who brought the thing, right? Who started
Yeah.
the CubeSat adventure.
Yeah, Bob Twiggs and I, we were the ones that started it. Yeah, and it was, and we were both in the same boat. I had moved to Cal Poly, so I wasn't building spacecraft at the time, but I had worked on spacecraft at Arizona State for students, and he was doing it at Stanford, and we both had the same frustration that the students built spacecraft and then launching them was impossible. So you had these projects that lasted for years and years and years, well beyond the life of the students as students. Yeah. And then they sat on a shelf waiting for a launch. And the launch people didn't want to launch them because they were like, student stuff, it's scary, it's dangerous, it's a risk item, we don't want to do it. And then there were some universities in Europe that were doing better because they were going to Russia to launch their spacecraft, but it was still complicated and they were all different. And one of the things that we realized is if you give a student like 50 kilos to build a spacecraft, kinds of interesting, complicated things. Yeah. And you cannot do it in 2 years or 3. So the first thing we said is we should make it smaller so they cannot get themselves in trouble. You know, make it so it can only be a very simple thing. Yeah. And there was a conversation where we just basically said, what's the important thing to train the students? And the important thing was integration and testing and working on a clean room and understanding procedures and writing assembly stuff. The mission was really not on that list. So we basically said, what's the smallest thing that could be a Sputnik? You know, we want something that goes up and beeps. And we said, and I'm going to use my hands, it's just something about this big. You know, and literally a lot of people ask, you know, where did the 10 by 10? It's very precise, you know, there's all this spec with all kinds of numbers.
Way back when.
Yeah. And the answer is we wanted a picosat because it sounds cool. So it had to be around a kilogram. And we actually wondered how heavy spacecraft are. And we looked at some examples and the density of water came up as like, it's about, you know, that because there's lots of heavy things and lots of air. So we said, okay, if we make 1 kilogram is 1 liter, oh, it's 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. That's really cool. It's a cube. And it's a liter, and we can teach the American students the metric system. And it's very small, and it's light, so it should be easy to launch. So that's how the whole thing started. And then also Emerald, one of Stanford's projects, had deployed little tuna, basically the size of a sardine can, little spacecraft. They didn't have solar panels, they didn't have batteries. They were just testing some things for aerospace. So we knew that the idea of deploying these things out was doable. It just, they needed to be a little bigger to have solar cells and that kind of stuff. So that's where the 10 by 10 came. Then there was another thing that came about, that there are a few things that are really important for CubeSat. Usually they're not the ones that people think about. But the other one was, if you're going to get in a launch, the rocket is going to complain that you're dangerous. So we said, okay, we'll put them in a box and we'll test the hell out of the box. And then we'll go to the launch vehicle and we'll say the box cannot open. If the satellites disintegrate, your payload and your rocket are safe.
Yeah.
And that eventually worked. It didn't work at the beginning, but eventually we convinced them, and that really allowed us to go fly. And then along with that deployer and all that stuff came the standard, the spec.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found that we didn't expect is that when you put a spec out and you have launch accommodations that meet that spec, then as a developer, as a university, and we were thinking just universities at the time, you can go build your spacecraft, and whenever you finish, you know there'll be a launch for you. Because when we did it, we would pick a size, and every university would pick a different one because we're that smart. And then you have to find a rocket that could carry you, which was really complicated because nobody had carried anything like you before. So they had to do all the analysis again. Yeah. So standardization really clicked for this particular application. So that worked really well. And then the rest is history. You know, it took a few years. I mean, we put the standard out in 2000, and we didn't launch until 2003, and then 2006 we were launching every few years, and now we're launching every few weeks. So it's changed a lot. But the standard was very important. The people at the box was very important, and then sticking with the standard was the other thing that was very important. And there's a very funny story. When somebody came to me and there was like several people that said, you really need to make this bigger because we can do more things if you make the box bigger. And we had spent months and years qualifying that box to fly on one or two vehicles. And I'm like, I'm not doing that again. You know, this is crazy. We've spent, it took a lot of effort. If you cannot do it on this box, then do something else. But I'm not changing the box.
Yeah.
And at the time, we weren't flying yet. I mean, we were just like about to fly, or we had one flight. And then years later, the same person said, you were right. The standard was really important. And people figure out what to do with a smaller size. They didn't really need the size. They just were lazy. You know, they just wanted to make it bigger. And what he says, this is Walter Holman's from, he makes the light bands.
Okay.
And planetary systems. And he said, the best analogy that I've heard about how CubeSat came about is we walked into a room with an empty wall, and we threw a dart at the wall, and then we painted the bullseye around it. So the second person that came into the room said, wow, you guys really nailed the bullseye. You know, you hit it in the middle. And he's like, yeah, we did. But if you came earlier, you realized that it wasn't. We just came up with something that, because it sounded okay, there was no math behind it. There weren't years of analysis. And then once it worked, everybody thought it was genius because it's like, yeah, you can do amazing things on that size. And it's like, yeah, because very smart students have figured it out, but not because we knew. But for a while, it was kind of a little secret. You know, we didn't let people know. Now we're more comfortable with it. We can let you know that no, it was a shot in the dark, and then we painted the bullseye later.
It's very interesting that, I mean, those who will watch this hear it because you know the 2000 and 2001 articles are excessively cited in the nanosatellite community.
Yeah.
Excessively. And it's interesting that now they can see, you know, one of the guys telling the story of that paper, right? And it brings it a bit more to life.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. And let me go to the other question, because that question was the beginning, right? And this question now, I think, takes us to where we have come today and where we can go. And it says, where is it? What is the relationship and collaboration between robotics, artificial intelligence, software, and space exploration?
That's a very good question. And I think for many years, there was space exploration is robotics to a large extent.
Yeah.
And it uses software. And it uses, in many cases, some sort of crude artificial intelligence since the beginning. You know, we had these robots that went to Mars.
Yeah.
The one thing that had happened by the time we came along is that that industry had separated from the rest of the industry that did software and robotics and artificial intelligence. And because everything needed to be space qualified and tested in space before it flew in space, which when you think about it is a contradiction. You know, you cannot fly something that has flown in space for the first time in space. So you ended up flying things that were 10 years old. The missions took a decade to design. And at the beginning of the design, they picked a component that flew for 10 years that had been picked 10 years. So they were flying things that were 20 years old.
Yeah.
And it really was limiting. The software written for space was super efficient, you know, very careful because we don't have memory, we don't have computing power. What CubeSats did is we basically connected space with the electronics revolution that the iPhones and the laptops and all those things created. And all of a sudden, the computational power is infinite. The amount of memory you have is as large as you want. And now, we were using artificial intelligence before, if you want to say that, but it was really dumb artificial intelligence. And now we have really smart artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing now is a connection between the normal non-space industry, the artificial intelligence that's used for face recognition or networks of cell phones, being applied directly to networks of spacecraft or image recognition from satellites and all those things. So it's really an interesting phenomenon. I don't know really if it has a name, but the way I would answer that question is it's this robotics and artificial intelligence and software, it's all the same, whether you're space or you're something else. If you work on a satellite in school, you can go work for Apple. And we've had students do that.
It's true. And it's important to realize also that wherever people are today, you know, building software, building artificial intelligence models and stuff, it doesn't really require an excessive bridging program to dive into space and nanosatellites.
Exactly. And the other thing that's very interesting is the biggest innovations we're seeing are coming from people from outside space.
Yes.
That are bringing ideas that the space community was not aware of. You know, there's astronomers that have really cool telescope designs to look at the stars that are saying, well, if I turn the telescope around and I point at Earth, maybe I can do something interesting. Yeah. And the same thing with some of the electronics things that we're doing and the networking. It's coming from the ground. It's non-space people that are saying, why are you guys doing it this way? You know, there's this other thing that we do. And that has really energized the industry. The idea that people feel free to come and express an opinion, I think, from outer space. Yeah. Before it was rocket science. So if you were a communications engineer that worked on telephones, your skills are irrelevant. And now it's completely different. Everything is really, really closely related.
No, beautiful.
And I don't know if I answered the question, but I think it's really my view is that people think about space as a different thing, and we need to start thinking about it as just one more of the many high-tech industries that feed off the same stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I quite like the answer. I would like, you know, to shift towards the end of the last part of the program, at least the way it's designed today. I imagine over time it may evolve. But I would like you to please share a personal experience in your journey where you had to overcome difficulties. Because, and I say this in a sort of a loose way, because the idea is to inspire, but not just in a cliche, you know, nice sentences, you know, you can do it way. But it's your real experience, you, a human being who, you know, had to push through a few things.
Well, there is I'll tell you a story, but first I'll tell you a bigger picture thing. I mean, when we started CubeSats, there were toys. Yeah. And many people said, this is not, it cannot do anything, it's worthless, don't waste your time. For that one, we were teaching students, and we knew we could do it with CubeSat. So that was an irrelevant criticism for us, and we kept moving. And a lot of people have asked, why did you guys keep moving? And the reality is we were just training students, and we could do that. But there was one moment, so we couldn't get launched in the US because we couldn't, nobody would do it. Everybody thought it was too risky, and they would deal with it. So we decided to go to Russia, which we couldn't do because of ITAR. So they say, you cannot export the satellites to Russia. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too complicated. Mm-hmm. And we decided we're just going to try. So we got a few universities together. We were charging like $40,000 for a 1U CubeSat, which was really cheap at the time. And the university staff were helping us with export license, and we actually managed to do it. We talked to the State Department, and once they understood that the satellites were really tiny, that they weren't doing anything interesting, they're like, oh yeah, sure, yeah, you can export that. That's not a problem. But we filed all the paperwork, we did everything, and in 2003, we had 11 universities put 14 satellites on a Dnepr in Russia, one of the most reliable rockets in. Basically spend the funds of the CubeSat community to get this launch going. And we had the first failure of the Dnepr, I think since the beginning of the program. It had never happened before. I mean, I remember being interviewed before the launch at the school when we were going to have the president of the university was there. So are you confident that this is going to work? And I'm like, this is one of the most reliable rockets in the world. We're really happy we're flying with it. We're going. Yeah. And it blew up. And story, it was nice. We learned a lot, and then everything went up in smoke. Big hole in Kazakhstan. We're done. And the thing that we didn't realize is that there was a lot of people that were watching us that thought there may be something here, but I'm not willing to commit yet. And they didn't believe we were actually going to do it. And I got a couple of phone calls after the accident where people said, don't be too upset because you guys were there. And a lot of people didn't believe you were going to be there. A lot of people didn't think you were going to finish the satellites and actually have deployers that work, and all these things. We had a previous launch, but it was only like 4 satellites in 2003, so it wasn't as big as this one. This one was the big one. Yeah. And then all of a sudden I got a call from somebody, and they say, hey, there's a lot of people that are really upset that all these universities had to go to Russia to launch their satellites. And I'm like, yeah, but these are from the same organizations that didn't want to launch our satellites before. Yeah. And it's yeah, but there was a lot of people watching you that they wanted you to succeed because they saw something, but they couldn't speak up yet. You were there, you made it, now we can say something. And they use that idea that all these American universities lost their satellites in Russia to get the US government to open up rockets for launching in the US. Wow. And it was very interesting that we truly thought it was the end. But what we didn't know is how much we had accomplished. We had built the satellites, we had tested the satellites, we delivered on time, we were bolted to the rocket. We went through the whole process, which is really hard. Everybody waits for that cherry on top, when you launch, but getting there is really hard. Yeah. And that's something that I tell people when they say, well, we built a spacecraft, it didn't work. So it's a failure. And I'm like, wait a minute. The operations are a failure, but you learn a bunch of stuff. You did a lot of things before. That counts for something. And in our case, it counted for the whole program actually getting a boost out of a huge failure. But it worked really well. And we've seen similar things with people that were in the same boat, that they would do something, it wouldn't work, and then that kind of activated supporters and people say, hey, but you guys were so close, we're really going to help you. Yeah. And the fun thing about the story is that of those 11 universities, I think 8 or 9 had satellites in orbit within a year. Awesome. Because they found all the launches and their support structure activated. They said, you guys were almost there. You were on the right up.
Yeah.
And you did it. You had everything. So that was an interesting story. It was a really bad day when we started. But within a week or two, it was like, wait a minute, what's happening? I'm still getting phone calls. I thought nobody would want to talk to me after that. It's like, oh, it's over, it doesn't work. And it was the opposite. It's like, oh, this works. We could do it again. And we did, and it worked very well.
And we're grateful for that failure because now, it was the turning point not only for you, but basically for the rest of the today nano-satellite community. Because now there's the ISS launches, there's all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Because people who were just watching saw a failure and were like, I think from hearing you, maybe some of them were like, you know what? Had we supported earlier, maybe we would have succeeded right here. They wouldn't have needed to.
Well, and then the other thing that happened is that nobody expected commercial off-the-shelf components to work.
To work in space, yes.
And then they started working, and the Japanese had a Qt4, was it? That lasted for like 10 years or something.
Yeah, then some change in space. It's quite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all those stories about radiation will fry you in 2 weeks. It's like, but that's not what's happening.
Yeah.
And what we realized is the space industry was very conservative because everything they did was very expensive, and it was like national pride, and they were being very, very safe. And when we started taking risks, a lot of things that were very risky worked very well. So that was a turning point.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. It's good to tell stories. Us all guys, we like to tell stories.
I hope we meet soon. Once movement becomes normal again, because there's a couple of events I was supposed to attend where we might or might not have met, both in Japan and Europe and in South Africa. But
once things open up, we'll cross paths.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your time and the availability.
Hey, no problem. I still owe you Bob's contact info. I just realized. So I'll send it to you at some point. I'll make an intro email. And then keep me posted on how you're doing. I know that you just started and you're still standing, which is good.
Still standing. That's
yeah. Yeah, it takes a while, but you're doing well. And I think you're in a very interesting place because the energy that I'm seeing where you are is pretty high. So there is a need for people doing what you're doing.
Thank you. It's boiling over here, indeed.
Yeah, I know.
There's a lot going on.
Hey.
Thanks.
Hey, no problem. And say hi to everybody over there.
I will.
And I'll try to stop by soon.
All right, great. You keep well, stay safe and healthy during these.
I'll try.
Keep well.
Yes. Okay.